I'm Mike Lyons, and I'll be your host today for another oral history for the Jacksonville Broadcasters Association. The association's purpose is to preserve the rich history and contributions of the area's radio, television, and broadcasting industries. Our guest today is Marcia Ladendorff, who was a former reporter anchor at CNN and then later at Channel 12 for about 7 years, and now at UNF teaching media-related courses. Marcia, thanks for being with us today and talking about your career. As we sit down, it's May of 2019. Let's go back to your college days at Arizona State University. You had no, as I understand it, you had no intention whatsoever of being in broadcasting.
No, I'm not one of those people who came out of the womb wishing to be on television. In fact, it didn't even occur to me. I was going to be an opera singer. I had been in music and theater ever since I was 9 years old, and I studied opera at classical singing at Whittier College first, and then I transferred to Arizona State University. And I had decided at that point that I really didn't have the exceptional voice that it would take to be as successful as I wanted to be. So I was looking around for another major, and somebody said, "Why don't you major in television?" I said, What do? You just sit around and watch TV? And they said, "Oh no, you learn how to make it." And I was like, huh. And when I walked into a studio on campus, I realized the connection between what I've been doing all my life, theater, and what we do here. And I said, oh, I could do this. And it was the beginning of a long career.
And you just switched your major at Arizona State and went into communications.
I did.
And your first job was at a station in Phoenix.
Yes, KPHO. I was a studio cameraman. People used to say, well, what do we call you, a camera person or what? And I said, that's a title of a job. It's not intended to indicate gender, so you call me a cameraman. And I did that for about a year until they moved me up to the newsroom, where I was a film editor. That tells you how long ago that was. And I did that for a while, and then I got the call from Rochester, New York. They wanted me to be a
You told me you were the first person to do something at
Well,
KPHO?
we don't know that for sure, but we understand that at least in the West, I was the first woman to run a studio camera, yeah.
And then it was on to Rochester, New York at the age of 22, I think.
Yeah,
you
somewhere
told me
22, 23, something like that.
And that was a rather unusual experience. Union's a big deal up there, and I guess that was a big part of what happened to you there. Tell me about that.
Oh, it was miserable. They told me they were going to train me to do, I didn't know anything. I didn't know anything about weather. I'd never been in front of a camera. And they said, oh, don't worry about it. We'll train you. We'll, send you to weather school, and we'll give you all sorts of coaching. And I said, oh, okay. And it was double my pay. At the time, I was making $8,000 a year in Phoenix, and they were going to pay me a whopping $16,000 a year. And I was like, whoa. And so I drove my 1965 Chevy Bel Air across the country to Rochester, New York, where they didn't train me for anything. They shoved me on the set, and I must have been just a wreck. They had to, actually the first show, they had to talk me out of the stall in the women's room to get me to go on the set, because I said, I know I can't do this. And really I couldn't. I stumbled my way through 3 months of that. The man I replaced organized, we came to find out later, organized a write-in campaign. Every Sunday there would be these horrible, awful, nasty letters in the TV tab about how inept I was and how I didn't know what I was doing. And they called me a simpering debutante. And it was demoralizing. But the union saved me. The management went to the union, and they said, at the end of my probation period, they said, we've done her wrong. And the union said, yes, you have. And the union said, we'll give her another 90 days, but this time she should be a reporter. And that's where I belonged all along. And so they did. They gave me a chance, and I made it through the probationary period, and that's when things clicked for me.
And a reporter, that's something you really enjoy doing.
I loved it. All throughout my career, if they had not paid slave wages, I would have stayed as a reporter.
There was a strike in Rochester, too,
Yeah.
you told me about. Tell me about that.
Yeah, there was a Rustcraft. We referred to it in other terms. We had a play on words. I don't know if I can say this on TV, but they told us that they wanted us to take a 30% pay cut. And we said, oh my goodness, is the company in trouble? This is our company too. And they said, no, we just don't think you're worth what we're paying you. And we went, they want us to go on strike. So we did. And I can't remember, I think the strike was 5 or 6 weeks long. Actually, I ate better on strike because the people in the community were very supportive of the union. I went home one night and found a bucket with a red cloth over it, and in it were 2 live lobsters somebody had left for me to cook. After the strike was over, I got a phone call from the competing station, Channel 13, and they said, please don't go back, come work for us instead. And so I said, I don't want to walk back in that station where they don't want me. And I said, okay. So I went to work for them for about a year before I ended up going to South Bend, Indiana.
Mm-hmm. That's the home of Notre Dame, and they had a station there, and you worked there?
WNDU.
You were an anchor producer. I really never heard of that, anchor producer. How did that work?
It was very difficult. There was a night when the chief photographer was supposed to take the film, the two film reels, to the projection room, and he got distracted on the way and got a phone call, laid the film reels down on the desk, and then after the end of the phone call went to his car and drove home, leaving the film reels on the desk. And as we went into the opening for the newscast, I'm sitting on the desk, and my co-anchor read the intro to the first story, and we went to black, and this disembodied voice in the studio came over and said, there's no film. We went, what? There's no film? Yeah. So fortunately, my co-anchor was a lot more glib than I was at that stage, and he did a little soft shoe while I frantically ran through the station trying to find the film. And some 20 minutes later, we did find it, loaded it up, and my dear Mike Lyons was his name, started to read. He read the intro for the first story again. He says, oh, as we told you 20 minutes ago. And we went ahead and did the beginning of the show at the bottom of the show.
First 20 minutes you had to do radio.
Well, actually, the first 20 minutes we did sports and weather.
Oh, really? Yeah. To get around it.
Yeah.
That was your experience there. Then you went on to, moved on to Omaha.
Omaha, Nebraska, where I was an anchor. And I also covered the Strategic Air Command, which was based at the time at Offutt Air Force Base. Mm-hmm. It was very exciting. I got to do cool things like go into the underground command post and cover what was going on down there. That's where they had the red button, and they would communicate with Air Force One if there was a war and the president would be moved into that airplane. I got to actually fly in what they called a Christine, which is a plane that is able to give and receive fuel. And I watched a refueling mission from the cubby with the guy who flies the refueling hose, I guess you call it. Yeah. It was really wonderful, and I worked with some really top-notch public relations people who were connected to SAC and the Air Force Base.
So that was a fun time as a reporter then.
It really was. I loved reporting. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then you had, I guess, a big move, CNN. You ended up at CNN next.
Yes.
How did that happen? Explain that.
I had just signed a contract, renewing my contract in Omaha, when I got a call from a guy named Sam Zellman, and he said, don't you want to be a pioneer? And I said, oh, I always want to be a pioneer. And so he said they were still looking for some anchors to come and launch this CNN. And I'd heard about it, and I thought, I mean, I've always been a risk taker, and I've always wanted to be on the ground with something new. And so I went to my general manager, who was very gracious, and he said, you know, I don't want to stand in the way of you exploring this, but you have to understand that this cable TV thing is going to kill the local stations. And I said, I got it, but I want to go do this. And he said, okay, and he let me out of my contract, which was unheard of course. And I remember going down and interviewing for the job. This will tell you a little bit about CNN in the early days. they put me in a room with another young, attractive, blonde woman, and she's sitting across the other side. And of course, you know, you can tell when somebody's a young, blonde, attractive person, they're there to interview for an anchor job. I'm looking at her, she's looking at me, you know, we're going, oh. And we didn't know how many jobs were open. So Zellman comes in. We must have sat there for 45 minutes, maybe an hour, waiting to be interviewed. And Zellman comes in, and he says, "Let's go to lunch, okay?" And we were like, "Really? You're going to take?" Yeah, we'll take both of you. So he took us out to the parking lot. He had a Rambler, one of those Nash Rambler cars with the two-door. And so one of us was going to have to sit in the back seat. Well, I went to the passenger side, and I opened the door, flipped back the front seat, because you know, you had to climb in the back, and said, "After you." And Denise LeClaire, who was the other woman there, she shot daggers at me, and she climbed into the back seat, and we went and had lunch with Sam Zellman, and that was our interview. We were interviewed together, and he said, "Sure, you can have it." And we went, "Really?" Okay, it was the most unprofessional job interview I've ever had.
And you both ended up there.
We both ended up there. After we went back to our homes, she and I talked over the phone and shared what our offers were. I was offered a little bit more than she was because she wanted to go to CNN because she was the fiance of a director they wanted very badly. And so therefore they offered her a piddly amount of money because they knew she'd take it. Right. And they offered me a little bit more, but it wasn't much. Right. Yeah.
That was a new 24-hour-a-day cable news operation, something very new. What was that like, being in on the ground floor of that?
Oh, it was a slide for life. I mean, every time you went in and sat on the anchor set, I used to say they need seat belts because you just never knew what was going to happen. You know, you needed to strap in and hope that things didn't go awry. The director's booth was right next to, it was in a pit right next to the anchor set. So when things went wrong, you know, you'd hear this yelling and screaming down at the foot of where you were sitting. The news, you know, was open. I mean, the set was right there in the middle of the newsroom, and right. So every time all heck broke loose and people started screaming and hollering, it was all going on behind you, yeah. You know. And when the American hostages were released, after they were held during Jimmy Carter's presidency, after they were being held in Tehran. We were trying to get satellite connection because we were always stealing satellite, you know, links from other other networks because we couldn't afford it ourselves. And something was going wrong, and Reese Schoenfeld, who was the president of the network, was just furious, and he was stomping back and forth because he thought we had a shot, but we didn't have a shot. And he went marching from one end of the newsroom up toward the director's booth, which is right next to us, okay? And he was screaming at the top of his lungs, "Get those," because they had a shot of the anchors, "get those prime a-holes off the air." And there were two anchors sitting on the set, Bob Kane and Renelda Muse. And Renelda was such a gentle woman, and you could see her hands, and you could see the tape. They were rolling tape on this, and her hands began to curl up on the desk as she's looking into the camera, reading, you know, because you could clearly hear Reese having this tantrum. At which point, Reese's wife began to make the rounds of all the edit bays, trying to collect all the videotapes recording his tantrum. Well, of course, she didn't get them all, you know, and eventually that was his demise.
Mm-hmm. You were at CNN for how long?
I was there for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it got better and better, I assume, as they got more used to doing what they were doing?
I loved those early years. I go back now and, tore through, and it's so institutionalized now. Back then, it was like the wild, wild west. I mean, yeah, we were good. They hired some good people who really, really knew what they were doing, and there were no rules. We were making it up as we went along, and during those first 7 years, everything was just, kind of as we go. I mean, one time, Renelda and I were anchoring, and I'm telling these great stories. Reese Schoenfeld had gotten a tip. This was during the time when I can't remember which pope it was, but the pope was gravely ill, and everybody was trying to figure out what he had. And Reese Schoenfeld somehow had a contact who had told him that the pope had a venereal disease. And so he was all excited because he had this breaking news, and he told the producer that this is what the Pope had, and he wanted us to break the news. Well, Renelda and I were the anchors who were on the set, and the producer said, Reese Schoenfeld has breaking news that the Pope has this venereal disease, and we have to break in and do this. And I looked at Renelda, and she looked at me, and I said, I'm not saying that. And she said, I'm not saying that. And everybody kept pushing us to say this, and we said, we're not saying that. Are you kidding? I am not going to be the face of the person who says the Pope has a venereal disease. Not doing it. It's the only time. I mean, we both figured that we would either get fired but we were not going to go on the air and be the people who were going to say that.
You told me that at CNN, when you first were going there for your job, you didn't end up anchoring at the studio. What happened?
Well, it was very typical CNN. I was at home in Omaha. I had packed everything to go to Atlanta, and I had a party at my house. All of the people from Offutt and SAC and from the media community and the police community, because I worked nights and I got to know a lot of folks in the police community. I'd reported on court. There was a mob, a little kind of gang who couldn't shoot straight that I covered in the courts. And everybody was at the house, and we were having a party, and the phone rang. And I picked up the phone, and they said, hey, this is CNN. We've changed your airplane tickets. You're not going to Atlanta. You're going to Washington to Mount St. Helens. And I went, I packed for Atlanta, and now I'm going to go to Washington. They said, yeah, you're going to cover Mount St. Helens. Well, Mount St. Helens had exploded weeks before. And I was like, really? But has it erupted again? And they said, no. I said, so what do you want me to cover? And they said, I don't know, you have to figure it out. You got to go to Mount St. Helens. And I went, okay. And so on June 1st, which was my debut at CNN, there I was standing in all the ash in Mount St. Helens doing a live report, playing what we call catch up in the business. As was often the fact. We were often a day late and $1 short on stories, and we found ourselves playing catch up to all the other organizations. So I did a lot of repacking that night, yeah.
How long did it take you to get back to Atlanta?
I think I was up there for about 4 or 5 days, and then I got back to Atlanta, and it was a real culture shock for me, of course, because not only did I shift from Omaha to Washington, but then from Washington, I was still picking the ash out of my hair, and I didn't have the right clothes, and I walked into the newsroom, and I was like, oh wow, and then I didn't know what my schedule was, and honestly, they didn't care. I walked into the newsroom, and I was like, okay, what's my schedule? And they shoved a script in my hand and said, you're on next. So that was the way it was. And to be honest, that was what was so exciting about it.
So then CNN, you come to Jacksonville, Florida.
Yeah.
To Channel 12.
Yes.
How did that come about?
Well, I had become pregnant with my first child at CNN, and and halfway through the pregnancy there was a problem, and the doctors made me go on bed rest for 16 weeks. Well, again, CNN made me sign a paper saying I would come back, but they didn't like my agent. And so after I had my child and had recovered, I said, okay, I'm ready to come back. And they said, well, you can come back, but only if you fire your agent. And, you know, I'm sort of an idealist and a loyalist, and I was like, you know, my agent has been really good to me, and I just don't feel like I can do that to him. And they said, well, too bad, there's no room for you here. And I said, okay. And I'm kind of stubborn that way. And so I began to look for other work. And what happened was that the station here had hired Lee Webb, who was coming out of a sportscaster's position. And they were looking for somebody who would balance that and would come from a hard news tradition. And so when they found out that I was available, they wooed me. And I came down with my newborn baby and even had to change her diapers in the back seat of Dave Richardson's car during the interview as we were walking around, and got the job. And so that's how I ended up here.
Mm-hmm. So that was quite a difference from Atlanta to Jacksonville.
Yeah.
What did you think when you first got here about the station, the market, and the city?
Well, it actually it was nice because working for CNN, really what you did, you were kind of chained to the anchor chair, and I did miss, you know, as I told you, I really loved reporting, and really all I did, I worked 4 shifts at CNN. I was on an hour, off an hour, on an hour, off an hour, you know, and so all I did was just read scripts, and I didn't even get a chance to write my own scripts, because once I'd get off a show and I'd go and say, okay, I'm getting ready for the next one, they'd already have the show written. And so there was a lot that was missing that was pleasing to me about the process. So, and I didn't know the market and the market didn't know me because Atlanta wasn't wired, you know, so I didn't have any attachment to Atlanta the way you do when you're in local news. Mm-hmm. So this was a pleasure for me. I didn't like the smell when we first came. I have to confess, the paper mills were a bit off-putting, but we ended up, you know, Dave was real smart. He took me out to the beach, and so we ended up really enjoying it and bringing up our children here. So. Mm-hmm.
And the station, you were the 6 and 11 anchor.
I was.
Female mm-hmm. anchor, and those were about the only shows back then, correct? And that had to be a big deal for you, but I guess you got a chance to report as well because you said that's what you liked doing?
Yeah, actually, initially, that's what they wanted me here for, was because of my news chops. And so periodically I would go out and do stories, or I would do series during ratings, you know, that sort of thing. Okay. They wanted me to be the editorial sort of influence. And so I loved that, because that's the whole reason I got into the business in the first place, was because, you know, I grew up during Watergate. And so that's what moved me, was the idea that I had a responsibility to report and to be the fourth estate. Mm-hmm. And so I really enjoyed that.
And Jacksonville was a very competitive news market at the
time.
It
was.
When you were here?
Yeah, we were supposed to take down Channel 4.
Mm-hmm. And that was a tough assignment.
Well, we came very close.
Uh-huh.
We did. We came very close, and especially at the 11 o'clock slot, we really did. We came very, very close, and we're proud of that. What we did was we put out the best product that we could. We tried not to do the same show that they were doing, you know, because that's always a temptation to try to better the competitor by doing the same thing they're doing. No, we just did what we thought was a good show, and we did well.
Mm-hmm. And there were some real talented people there at Channel 12. I mean, some of them still there today. I assume you worked with Tim Deegan, Ken Amaro.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I'm proud to say that I was one of the voices who convinced Dave to put Tim Deegan on as a regular weather guy. Tim was sort of the weekend guy, I think, at the time, and Ray, I can't remember his name, that's terrible, was the weather guy, and then he left. And I said, you know, Tim's young, he's handsome, you know, you really ought to, and he looked at me and thought, what, that surfer dude? And I said, no, I really think he would be good. And so Tim became the anchor. Harmon Wages came on for a while and did the sports. Lee Webb was a real gentleman, and in fact, Lee and I were kind of like the odd couple, because Lee was very, you know, buttoned up, and I'm sort of, I don't know what you want to call me, but I'm not buttoned up, that's for sure. We used to mess around with Lee in the newsroom because he had this display of flags. He had a little wooden block with these little flags put in them. I'm not even really sure what the flags were.
I think I've seen that before.
Yeah, and he, whenever he would leave at night, he would put a piece of paper that said, please do not use on his keyboard for his computer or his typewriter, and because we were still using typewriters back then, and he would put this piece of paper, and he would put everything, and all of his books were aligned, fingers, away from. So when he would go at night, then we would go in and poke the books so that they were out of order, and we would move the flags around, and then we would shove the piece of paper over, and then the next day he would come in and go, and he'd move everything back, and he and I would periodically have conversation. Oh, one story we used to have conversations about words, because I love words. And one night we were having a conversation about behemoth, okay, the word behemoth, which means huge, giant, huge. We were talking about that football player that they used to call the fridge. I can't remember his.
William the Refrigerator Perry.
There you go, William Perry. And I said, he's a real behemoth. And he said, how do you say that word? How do you say that word? I said, well, some people say it behemoth. And some people, we looked it up in the dictionary, there were two pronunciations, and I said behemoth or behemoth. And I said, I think the most common is behemoth. And he said, behemoth, behemoth, behemoth. So he was anxious to use that word. And so he chose to use the pronunciation behemoth. And so he went and used that word in his copy and talked about how William Perry was a behemoth of a football player. Well, the switchboard lit up, and when we got off of the set that night, there were just dozens of people who had called in. They couldn't believe that Lee Webb would call William Perry such a despicable, how could he be allowed? He should be fired. And we're going, what in the world? Well, we figured out that what people heard was BMF.
Oh.
Oh, yeah. And we said that, because that stands for Big Mother. You fill in the rest. And so Lee, of course, was mortified, because Lee would never curse. Never, never, never. He would never curse. And we had a little lesson about writing for the ear, right? And so he got into just a little bit of trouble, but really it wasn't a big deal. It was just that people heard something different.
Sounds like you had a lot of influence there. The thing to keep Tim Deegan or put Tim in there, he's still there.
Yes, he is. Well, no, I didn't have any influence. I just offered a perspective that he hadn't thought about, and Tim did his job. Tim was the one who had the influence, Tim did his job, and he did it well. It's just like Dan Hicken, a funny story about Dan is that, some people I rub the wrong way. I have a very strong personality, and I think at the beginning, when Dan began to do the newscast as a sports person, he didn't care for me, and I had to trade off to the sports person. And so he was a little snarky with me on the set. And you could tell if you watch that there was friction between us. And I at one point, you know, I sat down and I said, you know, I realize that you don't care for me, and that's okay. I mean, you can have your opinion, and I get it. But you just have to keep in mind that this is about our jobs. And if people out there see that we don't care for each other, that's going to make them feel uncomfortable, and they're going to switch to another channel. And then you and I are going to have to look for other jobs. And that clicked with him. The Dan Hicken of that day is not the Dan Hicken today. Dan Hicken is just a lovely man. Yeah. He's a wonderful guy. He was a very young, brash fellow back then. But that made a real point with him, you know. And things changed. We became best buddies on the air. He still didn't like me very much, but he does today.
Sure sound like to me you're almost running the show there in Channel 12.
Well, no, I wasn't running the show. Although I did have a lot of influence. But I think that anchors do because they're the ones who are the face of the station. And rightfully so. If they don't have influence, then, you know, I mean, then they just become hand puppets, right? I mean, you're being chosen to represent that. You become the Nike swoop, right? Right? Yeah. You're the icon. And so, yeah, I think you should, because it is your job. It is your livelihood. And if the lighting is bad, you should be able to say that the lighting is terrible, because I'm the one, you know, it's my job, right, on the line. Right. So I should be able to have my say. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it does make a difference. Mm-hmm.
You were at Channel 12, and you told me that it was at Channel 12 near the end that you had been there several years, that you came to feel like that broadcasting was no longer for you. Yeah. Explain what happened there. How did?
Yeah, I'm not, you know, I don't have a problem. A lot of people want to hide the fact that they, you know, fell out of favor with management or whatever. I did. I fell out of favor with management because what was happening in the business was that, you know, when I started, a lot of the people in the business were hard-nosed news people, you know, kind of like the old kind of front page, you know, the old movie front page news people, you know, and our goal was to do news, and it was at a time when we were considered, the news was considered a loss leader, that the stations didn't really want to put a lot of money into news, and, you know, we were forced to do it because of the FCC. Well, but then somebody figured out you could make a lot of money doing news, and that it was actually cheaper than buying a Seinfeld, you know, series or something like that. And then it all of a sudden became a product and became commercialized. And that's when we started doing things like going to the Shrimp Festival and signing autographs in the booth. And, you know, I didn't mind doing that because I liked meeting the audience, and I thought it was important for me to meet the audience. I think anchors really were the only ones who really understood what the audience wanted, because we were the only ones who went out and spoke at the breakfasts at the Lion Club and listened to what people said to us. We were the best market research there was, you know, but at the same time, that became our primary role, was to be the little puppets out there going, "Hi, how are you? Don't you love our station?" And honestly, that wasn't what I signed up for those many years before. and I really wanted to do news. And when we started arguing about what should lead the show, you know, and a story about, you know, an artist who had made arrangements with Marineland to shoot after hours, after it was closed, to shoot pictures with nude models in with the dolphins, in very tasteful art, you know. We think we should lead with this, you know. I'm going, what? That's not a lead story, you know. I mean, when we start arguing about that kind of stuff as leading our show, and we didn't even have video of it, you know, I began to have a problem with that. And I began to see that we were turning into this sort of sensational, you know, let's compete, and I had problems with it. I had problems with it. I thought our news judgment was going awry. So I began to become unhappy, and people began to make fun of me. And they used to say, oh, Marcia's got that scarlet J on her chest, you know, that big journalism J. And I think the turning point was when they found the last two victims of the Gainesville murders. You'll recall Danny Rolling had gone on a killing spree at UF. I was driving into work, and I heard on the radio that they'd found 2 more victims, and I picked up my big old cell phone that looked like a hiking boot and called into the station, and I said, they found 2 more victims, do you want me to just keep driving? And they said yes. And so I kept driving to Gainesville, and they sent over a live truck, and it was a circus, it really was. And I looked at it very differently, and it began to look sort of like one of those movies that you see, you know, Network and those, you know, broadcast news, all those kind of farcical movies about the news. And I began to think about what were we doing and how were we doing it. And then one night, they had sent all the students home, but there were some students who, for one reason or another, were not able to leave campus. The whole town was in this horrifying state of fear. It was really palpable. I mean, you could almost just reach out and touch it. The air was just filled with it. And I mean, the students who were left behind, I can't imagine the terror that they were experiencing. And they were so young, you know, 18, 19, 20 years old. So what the university had done was they wanted to bring all of them together and at the Green and try to bring them together to, you know, have some counseling or to talk them through, do some effort to try to calm them. And so we had set up our live equipment there. We were going to do a live shot there with the event in the background. And as I was standing there trying to prepare for what I was going to say, and they were setting up the gear and stuff, I turned around to look at the scene, as I often did when I was going to do a live shot. And I was looking around at what was going on, and there was this one young girl. I remember this as clearly as if it happened yesterday. She was in a heap on the ground, sobbing. Her hands were covering her face. She was clearly hysterical in sobbing into her hands. And she was surrounded by 3 cameramen. Their lenses were about a foot and a half away from her, and they were taking pictures of her. And that horrified me. I don't know if she was aware that they were there, but on some level she must have been. And all I could think of was that she was being re-traumatized by this experience. And I thought about the code of ethics that the Society of Professional Journalists has. And one of the items on the list is do no harm. And I began to think about all the things that we did in covering stories that caused harm to the people that we covered. And I felt sick. So that was kind of a turning point for me, and I'd already begun to feel uncomfortable with my role, and at that point I began to think that way. I began to notice how our concept of ethics had changed, that it became no big deal to go to Disney for the media day, take freebies from Disney, and I'm like, people wouldn't understand. They'd say, aren't you going to media day at Disney? And I'd say, no. And they'd say, well, why not? And I'd say, because that's accepting a gift from somebody that I might have to cover in the future, and that's a conflict of interest. And they go, oh, you're so, oh, come on, you know, and I'd be going, oh, no, you know? And it bothered me. And maybe I am, I don't know, maybe I am extreme, but it did bother me. And I began to really question what we were doing and how we were doing it and what we were becoming. And I'm telling you, there are so many good people in the business today. But when I stand back and I look at the coverage of the presidential, I mean, I look at the coverage of President Trump, and I think, first of all, maybe there are some good things he's doing, but I can't tell because everybody is focusing on the outrageous.
Right. So the opportunity comes for you to go to UNF and teach media. I mean, that had to be perfect timing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was. You know, my daughter went to the Child Development Center here when it was called the Child Development Center. I'm not sure what it's called now. And I always loved the campus, and I thought, wow, what a lovely place to be. And so when I called Adam Herbert, who was the president at the time, I could do that because I had interviewed him as a reporter. Hey, Adam, is there a place for me over there? And he'd say, yeah, sure, Marsha. And you know, I came over and started teaching. It was quite an interesting transition. I really do love it. And it's mostly because I love the students, even the ones I don't love, I love, because they give me so much energy, and they give me an opportunity to have them think about issues. And I tell them, first of all, ethics, when we talk about ethics, it's not something that you can teach in one class. Ethics is part of the conversation. It has to go in everything we talk about. Ethics is woven into media literacy. Ethics is woven into our advanced writing course. Ethics is woven into theories and effects. Even the announcing and performance class that I teach, there's ethics woven throughout the course. You can't have any conversation about this business without talking about ethics. It's part of the conversation. You know, talking about writing, making fact errors, how you deal with statistics. Ethics is there. It's part of the conversation. And what I've discovered is that a lot of young people have never even thought about this. And what I tell them is that this is the time when you should begin to think about these situations, because when you get into the business, these situations are going to come up, boom, like that. And if you haven't begun to process this idea of ethical writing or ethical reporting or ethical announcing, you're not going to have the time to go through that thought process. But if you've already started thinking about it, then when it comes up, you'll have already done the hard part, and it won't take you so long to consider that maybe I shouldn't go to Disney's Media Day. Maybe that's not such a good idea. Or maybe when I go to Huguenot Park and shoot a stand-up, it's not okay if I pick up all the trash around and assemble it for the stand-up. You know, if I can't get the right shot, well, maybe I'm just going to have to live with that.
And not make it up.
Yeah. I mean, I'm talking about a real experience that I had. I was doing a story about how trashed Huguenot Park, the one that I'm talking about is the one up near Mayport, okay? The ocean part. How it had become trash. It's a beautiful park. And there was garbage everywhere, but when we went to do the stand-up, we tried so many different angles, and we just couldn't get the right angle, you know, to show the swath of garbage. And, you know, I have no problem admitting that I screwed up. I said, well, let's just pick this piece up here and put it in the shot. We weren't taking it out of the trash can and we were just moving pieces for the effect. Well, that was ethically wrong.
Well, it sounds like you're having a lot of influence still at UNF for what I tell on students that are in the future. And glad that you came on with us and shared these stories. And I'm glad that you ended up being a broadcaster here in Jacksonville. It never would have happened if you'd have been an opera singer.
It's true. That's very true.
Thanks for being on
I would have been
today.
waiting tables.
Thanks for being on today.
All right.
Great.
Thanks,
Marsha.
Mike.